All of Tinjil's soldiers were invigorated from so much pork and beer, and all of them definitely wanted 20 white horses, because now they were searching desperately for Jonathan. They immediately began searching from morning to night, prying in every corner of every house in the valley. Jonathan kept himself in the hideout until he almost suffocated, and Vetter and Cater rode around everywhere, reading a proclamation out loud about my brother. I had the chance one time to hear it, too, about Tinjil's enemy, Jonathan Lionheart, who has gone over the wall without permission, and whose whereabouts in Wild Rose Valley are still unknown. They described what he looked like. He was a remarkably handsome, slender youth with light hair and dark blue eyes. They said, and I think that Jossie had described him well, and we heard about the death penalty again for those who sheltered Lionheart, and the reward one would receive for betraying him. While Vetter and Cater rode around bellowing about this, people came to Marius's farm to say farewell to Jonathan, and to thank him for everything he had done for them, which was probably much more than I knew about. "We'll never forget you," they said with tears in their eyes, and they brought bread and gave it to him, though they hardly had anything to eat. "You'll need it because it's a difficult and dangerous journey you're embarking on," they said, and then they hurried away to have time to hear Vetter and Cater once more, just for fun. The soldiers came to Marius's farm too. I sat on a stool in the kitchen, horrified as they strode about, and dared not move, but Marius was arrogant. "What are you looking for?" he said. "That Lionheart, I don't think he exists. He's just something you made up, so that you can go around and mess up folks' homes." They certainly did mess it up. They began inside the little room. They threw all of the bedclothes onto the floor. They then rummaged through a chest standing in there. They heaved everything out of it, which was pretty silly. Did they really think that Jonathan was hiding in the chest? Why don't you look in the kitchen cabinets?" asked Marius. But then they became angry, and they went into the kitchen and started working on the sideboard, and I sat there on my stool and felt hatred rising up inside me. This was the night we would leave the valley, Jonathan and I thought that if they found him now, I wouldn't know what to do. Fate couldn't be so cruel. That they would get Jonathan during his final hours in Wild Rose Valley. Marius had stuffed the sideboard with old clothes and sheep's wool and things to reduce the sound coming from inside the hideout, and they had heaved all that junk out onto the kitchen floor. And then I wanted to scream, to make the house collapse. Yes, because one of them put his shoulder against the sideboard to push it aside, but no cries came from me. I sat like a stone on my stool and just hated him, everything about him, his rough hands and thick neck and the wart on his forehead. I hated him, because now I knew that he was going to see the shutter to the hideout, and that meant the end for Jonathan. But there came a cry from Marius. "Look, fire," he shouted. "Has Tinjil said you should set our houses on fire?" I don't know how it started, but it was true. The sheep's wool burned briskly on the floor, and the soldiers hurried to put it out. They jumped and stomped and swore noisily, and at last they turned the water barrel over, so the fire was put out almost before it had begun. But Marius was still angry and scolded them. "Don't you have any sense in your head?" he said. "You can't toss wool on the floor right next to the fire, where it smolders and sparks." The one with the wart was furious. "Silence, old man," he said, "or else I know of several good ways to shut that mouth of yours." But Marius didn't allow himself to be scared. You will clean up after yourselves, he said. Look around here, it's like a pigsty. That was the right way to get them to leave. Clean up your pigsty yourself, old man, said the one with the wart, and he marched out first. The others followed, and the door was left wide open behind them. They have no sense, said Marius. What luck that it started to burn, I said. How lucky for Jonathan. Marius blew on his fingertips. Yes, small fires can be good sometimes, accidentally, he said, though you burn yourself when you throw glowing coals out the fireplace using your hands. But our sorrows were still not over. Whatever I'd believed, they looked for Jonathan in the barn too, and afterward the one with the wart went to Marius and said, You have 2 horses, old man. No one in Wild Rose Valley is allowed more than 1. You know that. We are sending a man here from the other side tonight. He'll take the one with the white blaze. You're giving it to Tinjil. But it's the boy's horse, said Marius. Really, well, it's Tinjil's now, anyway. That's what he said, the soldier, and I began to cry. Tonight we were to leave Wild Rose Valley, Jonathan and I. Our long underground passage was done, and not until now had I thought about it. How in all the world could we take Grim and Fialar with us? They couldn't crawl through the underground passage. What a nut I was to not have understood it before, that we must leave our horses with Marius. And wasn't that sad enough? But why must it be even more awful? Tinjil would have Fialar. It broke my heart in 2 when I heard it. The one with the wart pulled a little wooden tag out of his pocket and held it under Marius's nose. Here, he said, write your property mark here. Why should I do that? Asked Marius. Well, it means that you're joyfully giving the horse to Tinjil. I don't feel joyful, said Marius, but then the soldier went up close to him with a drawn sword. You certainly do, he said. You feel very joyful, and this is where you put your mark. And you'll give this tag to the man who comes over from Carmagnaca to take the horse, because Tinjil wants proof that you give of your own free will. Do you understand, old man? He said and showed Marius so that he almost fell down. What could Marius do? He wrote down his property mark, and the soldiers disappeared from Marius's farm to look for Jonathan in other places. It was our last evening with Marius. We sat at his table for the last time, and for the last time he offered us soup. We were sad, all 3. I was most of all. I cried. For Fialar's sake, and for Marius's sake. He had almost become my grandfather, and now I was leaving him. I cried too, because I was so little and scared, and I couldn't do anything at all, when the soldiers came and showed my grandfather. Jonathan sat quietly thinking, and suddenly he mumbled, If only I knew the password. What password? I asked. You must give the password when you go in or out through the main gate, didn't you know? He said. Yes, I know that, I said, and I also know the password. All power to Tinjil, our liberator. I heard it from Jossie, didn't I tell you? Jonathan looked at me. He stared at me for a long time, and then he began to laugh. Scotty, I like you, he said. Did you know that? I didn't understand why he was so happy about the password, because he wouldn't be going through the main gate anyway, but I was a little happy too, amidst all this sorrow, that I could cheer him up with such a little thing. Marius had gone into the room to clean up, and Jonathan rushed in after him. They talked in low voices to each other in there. I didn't hear much, just that Jonathan said, If I fail, then you'll take good care of my brother. Then he came back to me. Listen now, Scotty, he said. I'm taking the pack and leaving first, and you'll wait here with Marius until you hear from me again. It may take a long time, because I have a few things I must do first. Oh, I didn't like that. I've never been able to stand waiting for Jonathan, especially when I'm scared at the same time, and I was scared now. because who knows what Jonathan would meet out on the other side of the wall, and what was he thinking of doing that might fail? "You shouldn't be so scared, Scotty," said Jonathan. "You and Carl Lionheart nowadays, don't forget it." "You are Carl Lionheart." Then he said a hasty goodbye to Matthias and me and crept inside the hideout, and we saw him disappear down into his underground passage. He waved. The last thing we saw was his hand waving to us, and then we were left alone, Matthias and I. "Big Doddick doesn't know a mole is creeping underneath his wall right now," said Matthias. "No, but what if he notices when the mole sticks its head up out of the ground," I said, "and then throws his spear?" I was so sad, and I slipped out to the barn to see Fyalar. One last time I sought him out for comfort, but he couldn't comfort me when I knew that after tonight I would never see him again. It was dark in the barn. The window was small and didn't let in much light, but I saw how eagerly Fyalar turned his head when I came through the door. I went to him in his stall and threw my arms around his neck. I wished he could understand that it wasn't my fault. What must happen? "Though perhaps it is my fault," I said and cried. "If I had stayed in Cherry Valley, then Tinjil would never get you. Forgive me, Fyalar, forgive me, but I couldn't do anything else." I think he understood that I was sad. He put his soft muzzle against my ear. It was as if he didn't want me to cry, but I cried. I stood there with him and cried until I didn't have any tears left. Then I groomed him and gave him the last of the oats. Well, he split them with Grim, of course. I had such terrible thoughts while I groomed Fyalar. May he drop dead, the man who comes to take my horse, I thought. May he die before he crosses over the river. It was a terrible thing to wish, it really was, and it didn't help. No, he was probably on the ferry already, I thought. The ferry that they carry all their stolen goods with. Maybe he's already landed. Maybe he's coming through the main gate right now, and he'll be here soon. Oh, Fyalar, if only we could run away somewhere together, you and I. Just as I thought that, someone opened the barn door, and I screamed. I was so scared, but it was just Matthias. He had begun to wonder what was taking me so long. I was glad that it was dark inside the barn. He wouldn't see that I had been crying, but he understood because he said, "Little guy, if only I could do something, but a grandfather can't help with this, so just cry." Then I looked through the window behind him. Someone out there was approaching Matthias's farm, one of Tinjil's men, the one who would take Fyalar away. "Here he comes," I screamed. "Matthias, he's coming now." Fyalar neighed. He didn't like me shouting so hopelessly. The next moment the barn door was pulled open, and he stood there in his black helmet and black cloak. "No," I screamed, "no, no." But then he was already next to me and flung his arms around me. Jonathan did, because it was him. "Don't you recognize your own brother?" he said. When I struggled against him, he pulled me to the window so that I could see him better. Still, I could hardly believe it was Jonathan. He wasn't recognizable, because he was so ugly, uglier than me even, and not a remarkably handsome youth at all. His hair hung in soggy strips around him, not shining like gold, and he had put some kind of strange snuff under his top lip. I didn't know that you could become so ugly with so little. He looked stupid. I would have laughed if there had been time. But Jonathan clearly didn't have time for anything. "Quick, quick," he said. "I must leave immediately. The one from Carmagnaca will be here any minute." he stuck his hand out toward Marius. "Bring the tag here," he said, "because I'm sure you're giving both of your horses to Tinjil joyfully." "Well, what do you think?" said Marius, as he pressed the tag into his hand. Jonathan put it in his pocket. "I'll show this at the gate," he said. "Then the commander will see I'm not lying." It all happened so quickly. We saddled the horses faster than ever before, and during that time Jonathan talked about how he came through the main gate, because Marius wanted to hear. "It was easy," said Jonathan. "I gave the password exactly like Scotty taught me. All power to Tinjil, our liberator." Then the commander said, "Where are you from, where are you going, and what is your task?" "From Carmagnaca to Marius's farm to get 2 horses for Tinjil," I said. "Pass," he said. "Thanks," I said. "And now here I am. But I must go out through the gate before the next man of Tinjil's comes and wants in. Otherwise it will be difficult." We brought the horses out of the barn faster than I can say, and Jonathan swung himself up in the saddle on Grim. He held Fialar's reins next to him. "Take care of yourself, Marius," he said, "until we meet again." And so he trotted away, with both horses, just like that. "Well, but what about me?" I cried. "What should I do?" Jonathan waved to me. "You'll find out from Marius," he shouted. And I stood there and stared after him and felt foolish. But Marius explained it to me. "You understand that you could never slip through the main gate," he said. "You have to crawl through the passage as soon as it becomes dark. Then Jonathan will be there on the other side, waiting for you." "Are you sure?" I said. "Something could happen to him at the last minute." Marius sighed. "Nothing is certain in a world where there is Tinjil," he said. "But if things go wrong, then you come back and stay here with me." I tried to think of what it would be like, at first crawling along the passage completely alone. That was terrible, just that part. And to come up in the forest on the other side of the wall and not find Jonathan there at all. And sitting there in the darkness and waiting and realizing at last that everything had gone wrong, and then crawling back again and living without Jonathan. We stood in front of the barn, which was now empty, and then suddenly I thought of something else too. "What will happen to you, Marius, when he comes, the man from Carmagnaca, and there's not a horse in the barn?" "Well, of course there'll be a horse," said Marius, "because I have to hurry now and bring my own home. I've been boarding it at a neighbor's farm, while Grim stayed in my barn." "Yes, but then he'll take your horse instead," I said. "He better try," said Marius. At the last minute Marius brought his horse home, for just after he arrived the man came to take Fialar. At first he screamed and shouted and swore like all the rest of Tinjil's men, because there was only one horse in the barn, and because Marius wouldn't hand him over. "Don't try," said Marius. "You know we're allowed to have one horse, and you've already taken the other one, for God's sake, the one with my mark on it. I can't help it if you've made a mess of it all. That one blockhead doesn't know what the other does." Some of Tinjil's men became angry when Marius acted superior to them, but some of them became docile and meek, and the one who came for Fialar, he gave up completely. "Something must be wrong then," he said, and he slipped away toward the path, like a dog with its tail between its legs. "Marius, are you ever scared?" I asked, when the man wasn't visible any longer. "Yes, of course I'm scared," said Marius. "Feel how my heart is pounding," he said, and he took my hand and laid it on his chest. "We are all scared," he said, "but sometimes you can't show it." Then evening came and darkness, and it was time for me to leave Wild Rose Valley, and Marius— "Goodbye, little guy," said Marius. "Don't forget your grandfather." "No, never. I will never forget you," I said. and I was alone underground. I crept through the long dark tunnel, and I talked to myself the whole time, because it helped keep me calm and to not get scared. No, it doesn't matter that it's pitch black. No, you certainly won't suffocate. Yes, a little dirt is dropping down your neck, but it doesn't mean the whole tunnel will collapse you full. No, Doddick won't see you when you climb out. He's not a cat that can see in the dark. Of course Jonathan will definitely be there waiting for you. He is there. Do you hear what I'm saying? He is. And he was. He sat on a stone in the darkness, and a little way from him Grim and Fialar stood under a tree. Well, Carl Lionheart, he said, you're here at last. We slept under a spruce that night, and we woke early at dawn and froze. At least I did. A mist was lying between the trees. We could hardly see Grim and Fialar. They looked like gray phantom horses, and all the dreariness and silence around us. It was completely silent, and melancholy in some way. I don't know why things seemed so melancholy, and desolate, and frightening. Waking up that morning, I just knew that I longed to be back in the warm kitchen with Marius, and dreaded what awaited us, all the things which I didn't know anything about. I tried not to show Jonathan how I felt, because who knows, he might send me back, and I wanted to be with him through every danger, however risky it was. Jonathan looked at me and smiled a little. Don't look like that, Scotty, he said. This is nothing. It'll probably get worse. Well, that was comforting, but just then the bright sun came out and the mist vanished. The birds began to sing in the forest. All the gloom and desolation flew away at the same time, and it didn't feel so dangerous any more. I warmed up too. The sunshine was nice and warm already. Everything felt better. It almost felt good. Grim and Fialar felt good too. They had escaped from their dark stalls and could now graze on soft green grass again. They liked it, I think. Jonathan whistled to them, a quiet little whistle, but they heard it and came. Jonathan wanted to go away now, far away at once, because the wall is just behind that hazel thicket, he said, and I don't feel like coming face to face with Doddick. Our underground passage came up between a pair of hazelnut bushes, but the opening was no longer visible. Jonathan had covered it with twigs and branches. He marked the place with a pair of sticks, so that we could find the tunnel again. Don't forget what it looks like here, he said. Remember that large stone and the spruce where we slept, and the hazel thicket, because there may come a time when we'll be this way again, if not. Then he went silent and said no more, and we mounted our horses and rode quietly away from there. Then a dove came flying over the treetops, one of Sophia's white doves. There's Paloma, said Jonathan. I don't know how he could recognize her from so far away. We had waited a long time to hear from Sophia, and now at last her dove arrived. When we were already outside the wall, she flew right to Marius's farm. Soon she would fly down into her loft outside the barn, but only Marius would be there to read her message. It worried Jonathan. Couldn't the dove have come yesterday, he said, so that I could have learned what I need to know. But we must go on now, go far away from Wild Rose Valley, and the wall, and all of Tinjil's men that hunted Jonathan. We would make our way to the river, taking a detour through the forest, said Jonathan, and then follow the banks to Karma Falls. And there, little Carl, there you will see a waterfall like you've never dreamed of. No, I've never dreamed of one, I said. I've never seen a mighty waterfall. There really wasn't much I had seen before I came to Nangiala, not even a forest, as we rode through now. It was truly like a forest from a saga. dark and dense, and there were no cleared trails. We rode right through the trees, which slapped their wet branches against our faces, but I still liked it. Everything, seeing the sunlight flowing through the tree trunks, and hearing the birds, and the smell of wet trees and wet grass and horses, and most of all I liked riding there with Jonathan. The air was brisk and cool in the forest, but as we rode it became warmer. We would have a hot day, we felt it already. Soon Wild Rose Valley was far behind us, and we were deep within the forest, and there in a glade. With tall trees around it, we found a small gray cottage in the middle of a dark forest. How could anyone live in such a lonely place? But someone lived there. Smoke came out of the chimney, and a pair of goats grazed outside. Elfrida lives here, said Jonathan. She'll probably give us a little goat milk if we ask her. And we got milk as much as we wanted to have, which was good, because we had ridden far and had not eaten anything. We sat on Elfrida's stone steps and drank her goat milk and ate bread that we had with us in our pack, and goat cheese that Elfrida gave us, and a handful of wild strawberries I had picked in the forest. It all tasted good together, and our hunger was satisfied. Elfrida, she was a plump little kindly old woman, and she lived alone there, with just her goats and a gray cat for company. Praise God, I don't live within any walls, she said. She knew many people in Wild Rose Valley, and she wanted to know if they still lived. Jonathan told her. He was sad when he did, because most of it was news that a kind of old person must grieve to hear. That things would be so awful in Wild Rose Valley, said Elfrida. A curse on Tinjil and on Katla. Everything would be fine if only he didn't have Katla. She threw her apron over her eyes. I think she was crying. I couldn't stand to watch this, so I went to search for more wild strawberries, but Jonathan stayed and talked longer to Elfrida. I pondered while I picked my wild strawberries. Who was Katla and where was Katla? When would I find out? We reached the river little by little. It was during the hottest time of the day at noon. The sun was sitting like a ball of fire up in the sky, and it glittered on the water too, shining like 1,000 small suns. We stood high up on the hillside and saw the river far below us. What a sight it was! The river of the ancient rivers rushed toward Karma Falls, frothing and whirling. The mighty waters wanted to go there, and we could hear the falls far away. We wanted to go down to the water and cool off. Grim and Filar we turned loose in the forest, and they found a stream where they could drink, but we wanted to swim in the river, so we rushed down the steep hillside and tore our clothes off while we ran. Willow trees grew down at the river's edge. One willow stretched its trunk far out over the river and trailed its branches in the water. We climbed out on the trunk, and Jonathan showed me how to cling to a branch and lower myself down into the whirling water. But don't lose your grip, he said, because then you'll go to Karma Falls faster than is good for you. And I held tight so that my knuckles whitened. I swung there on my branch and let the water spill over me. Never have I had such a wonderful dip, and never one as dangerous either. I felt the pull of Karma Falls through my whole body. Then I climbed up on the trunk again. Jonathan helped me, and we sat in the top of the willow tree, as if in a green house, rocking over the water. The river skipped and played right under us. It wanted to entice us down again, to try and make us think it wasn't dangerous at all. But I only needed to dip my toes in, and with just my big toe, I could feel the pull that wanted to drag me in. As I was sitting there, I happened to glance up at the hillside, and then I became scared. Riders were up there, Tinjil soldiers with long spears. They came galloping, but because of the roaring water, We hadn't heard the sound of horses' hoofs. Jonathan saw them too, but I didn't notice him growing scared. We sat there silently and waited for them to ride past, but they didn't ride past. They stopped, they jumped off their horses as if they were thinking about resting, or something like that. I asked Jonathan, "Do you think they're after us?" "No," said Jonathan, "they're going from Carmanyaca to Wild Rose Valley. There's a rope bridge suspended across the river by Karma Falls. Tengil usually sends most of his soldiers that way. But they don't have to stop right here," I said. Jonathan agreed with that. "I really don't want them to see me," he said, "and get any ideas about Lionhearts in their heads." 6 of them, I counted, up on the slope. They talked noisily about something and pointed to the water, though we couldn't hear what they were saying. But suddenly one of them started driving his horse down the hillside, down to the river. He came riding almost straight at us, and I was glad that we were sitting so well hidden in the tree. The others shouted to him, "Don't do it, Park. You'll drown both yourself and your horse." But he, the one they call Park, just laughed and shouted back, "I'll show you if I don't make it to that rock and back. Then a round of beer is on me, I swear." Then we realized what he wanted to do. Part of a rock was jutting out of the river. The current broke around it, and only a bit of it was above the surface. But Park had happened to see it as they rode past, and now he wanted to show off. "The fool," said Jonathan. "He thinks the horse can swim against the current out there." Park had already thrown off his helmet and cloak and boots. Now he sat there on his horse's back, in just a shirt and pants, trying to force the horse down into the river. A pretty little black mare she was. Park shouted and kicked and urged her on, but the mare wouldn't go. She was scared. Then he beat her. He didn't have a whip. He beat her on the head with his fist, and I heard Jonathan sob, exactly like the time on the square. At last Park got what he wanted. The mare neighed and was terrified, but she rushed into the river just because that madman wanted it. It was horrible to watch it all, and to see how she struggled as the current took her. "She'll drift right to us," said Jonathan. "Park can do whatever he wants. He'll never get her to the rock." But she tried, she really did. Oh, how she struggled, the poor mare, and how deathly frightened when she realized that the river was stronger than her. Even Park finally understood that now it was a matter of life or death. Then he wanted her to go back to the bank, but soon he noticed that it wouldn't work. No, because the current didn't want what he did. The current wanted to pull him to Karma Falls, and he deserved it. But the mare, I pitied her. She was completely helpless now. They came drifting toward us, exactly as Jonathan had said. Soon they would pass us and disappear. I could see the terror in Park's eyes. He knew where he was headed. I turned my head to see Jonathan and shouted out. When I saw him, because he was hanging from a branch, dangling over the water as far as he could go. He hung there upside down, with his legs bent around the tree branch, and just as Park went under him, Jonathan grabbed him by the hair and dragged him in, so that he could grip a branch. And then Jonathan called to the mare, "Come, little mare, come here." She had already drifted past, but she tried wildly to get to him. She didn't have that oaf Park on her back now. Still, she was close to sinking. But then somehow Jonathan grabbed her reins and began tugging on them. It became a tug of war between life and death, because the river didn't want to loosen its grip. It wanted both the mare and Jonathan. I grew quite wild, and I shouted to Park, "Help them, you ox, help!" He had crawled up into the tree. He sat there safe and sound and very close to Jonathan, but the fool did nothing to help. He leaned forward and shouted, "Let the horse go. There are 2 others up in the forest. I could take one of them instead, just let go. You become strong when you're angry, I've always heard, and you could say that Park helped in that way, so that Jonathan was able to haul in the mare. But afterward he said to Park, "You numbskull, do you think I saved your life so that you could steal my horse? Don't you feel ashamed?" Maybe Park was ashamed, I don't know. He said nothing. He didn't ask who we were or anything. He just climbed up the slope with his poor mare, and after that the whole troop disappeared almost at once. We made a campfire at Karma Falls that evening, and I am sure that no fire, in any time or in any world, has burned at such a campsite as where we lit ours. It was a terrible place, horrible and beautiful, like nowhere else in heaven or on earth, I think. The mountains and the river and the falls, they were too grand and enormous, all of them. Again it was like a dream, and I said to Jonathan, "I can't believe this place is really here. It's a little bit like something out of a dream from ancient times. I'm sure of it." We stood on the bridge, the rope bridge Tinjil had built over the chasm that divided the lands, Karmanyaka and Nangiala, on either side of the river of the ancient rivers. The river, it came rushing down deep into the chasm under the bridge, and then it cast itself roaring down Karma Falls into an even worse and more terrible abyss. I asked Jonathan, how could anyone even build a bridge over such a frightening abyss? "Well, I want to know that too," he said, "and how many human lives it took. While they built it, how many fell down with a cry and disappeared into Karma Falls? That's what I want to know too." I shivered. I think I heard cries still echoing between the mountain walls. We were so close to Tinjil's land now. On the other side of the bridge I could see a widening path leading up through the mountains, the ancient mountains in Karmanyaka. "If you follow that path you'll come to Tinjil's castle," said Jonathan. I shivered even more, but I thought things could go as they pleased tomorrow. Tonight I would sit by the campfire with Jonathan for the first time in my life. We made our fire on a rock ledge high above the falls, close to the bridge, but I sat with my back to everything. I didn't want to see the bridge to Tinjil's land, or anything else either. I just saw the light from the fire as it flickered along the mountain walls. It was beautiful and a little frightening too, and I saw Jonathan's kind, handsome face in the firelight, and the horses which stood resting a little farther away. "This here is much better than my first campfire," I said, "because now I'm sitting here with you, Jonathan. Wherever I was, I felt secure as long as Jonathan was with me, and I was happy to finally sit by a campfire with him, like we had talked about so much when we lived on Earth. The days of campfires and the time of sagas. Do you remember what you said?" I asked Jonathan. "Yes, I remember," said Jonathan, "but I didn't know then that there would be evil sagas here in Nangiala." "Do you think it must always be like this?" I asked. He sat quietly for a while and stared into the fire, and then he said, "No, once the final battle is over, Nangiala will become a land where the sagas are beautiful again and life is simple and easy to live, as it was before." The fire flared up, and in the light I saw how tired and sad he was. "But the final battle, you see, Scotty, it can only be an evil saga of death and death and death. That's why Orvar must lead the battle, not me, because I'm not able to kill anyone." "No, I know that you couldn't," I thought, and then I asked him, "Why did you save Park's life? Was that so good?" "I don't know if it was such a good thing to do," said Jonathan, "but there are things you have to do, otherwise you're not a human being, just a piece of dirt. I've said this to you before." "But what if he'd realized who you were," I said, "and they had caught you?" "Well then, they would have caught Lionheart, and not a piece of dirt," said Jonathan. Our fire burned down, and darkness sank over the mountains. At first the dusk made everything seem friendly, and kind and pleasant for a time, but then came a black, roaring darkness in which you only heard Karma falls and couldn't see the smallest light anywhere. I crept as close to Jonathan as I could. We sat there leaning against the mountain wall and talked to each other in the darkness. I wasn't scared, but I felt a strange anxiety come over me. We ought to sleep, said Jonathan, but I knew that I couldn't sleep. I could hardly talk either, because of my anxiety. It was not because of the darkness, but something else. I didn't know what, and yet I had Jonathan next to me. Then there came lightning and thunder, which boomed along the mountain walls, and then it was on top of us, a storm. I knew it wasn't like any other storm. Thunder came rolling over the mountain with a roar, so that you couldn't even hear Karma Falls anymore, and flashes of fire chased each other. Sometimes there was a blazing light, and then in the next instant an even darker darkness. It was as if a night from ancient times had fallen over us. Then came a flash of lightning, more terrible than any other. In the blink of an eye it blazed, throwing light over everything that was there. And then in the light I saw Katla.